Well, thank you very much for the privilege of being here this evening. I'm so grateful for Western Reformed Seminary and your president for inviting me. I'm so grateful to be here with my son. He'll be joining us tomorrow night. Right now, I think he's watching a basketball game on TV. This evening, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to have an initial lecture that attempts to explain why the Westminster Assembly existed at all. Give you some background with a few reflections that might be useful for us. And then I will have a second lecture on the Westminster Assembly's attempt to reform the preaching ministry of the Church of England. The first lecture is entitled God's Soldiers. I'm just so delighted to be able to sing with you this evening from a hymnal. When I saw the big screen up there, I thought we were going to have a projected hymn. And honestly, this is just free advice. I think that an integral part of leadership training is about carefully analyzing the congregation's hymnal sharing techniques. I came to this transformative discovery during my own theological training. As I recall, I think it was about the time when I met my wife Emily, and I had been sharing a hymnal with her for some time, but in a bold move, sometime in my second year in seminary, I pivoted from the inner hymnal sharing position, where the person's beside you and your arm is between them, to the outer hymnal sharing position. The first is really Platonic. The second position signals active pursuit. The traditional nomenclature is a little bit confusing, but in the outer position, the hymnal holder deploys the arm that's furthest from his sharing partner, and thus reducing the distance between them if she actually wants to see the words, and potentially increasing intimacy between the sharer and the sharee. Of course, if the sharee adopts an opposing hold, it's all bad news. But if they adopt the matching hold, well, we can talk about that later. Actually, the hymnal pivot probably ought to be an integral part of your pastoral counseling classes. I haven't spoken to Dr. Backus about this, but I think it ought to be there. When you see the move from the inner to the outer with your singles, you kind of clear the calendar for premarital counseling. When it's dropped by married couples, it's probably time to dust off your Song of Solomon series and give it another go. Well, I'm here to talk to you, I believe, about the Westminster Assembly. The story, the backstory of the Westminster Assembly we could start with Constantine, but that we don't have time for that. So a logical place is to start with Henry VIII. And you've probably heard this before, but as Henry said to his wives, I won't keep you long. I'll be quick with this survey. Henry VIII was an equal opportunity persecutor. As he kind of meandered his way towards reform for reasons which are dubious, he burned both Catholics and Protestants to show his even-handed disposition. But he left his son with the church, not very reformed, but with permission to reform. And Edward VI came to the throne and had Protestant guides and regents who managed the nation while he was young, and then assisted him as he grew older. Edward has sort of two stages in his Reformation. The one marks the first Book of Common Prayer in English. It was not as reformed as the second one. The first one was more sort of Lutheran and kept a lot of different aspects of the traditional medieval church, but the second one really moved aggressively, helpfully, towards a biblical take on worship and a little bit better take on government. He died young, probably tuberculosis. And his sister Mary came to the throne. Mary tried to backtrack on the Reformation. It was hard to do. Her father and brother had plundered the church of many of its resources, and she found it difficult to turn the clock back. She too died relatively young, in her middle years, after brutally persecuting Protestants and causing many of them to flee to the continent to escape her penalties. When Mary died, her sister Elizabeth came to the throne. Elizabeth had conformed to Catholicism under Mary's rule. She had made some protests. And when she came to the throne, she had to decide what to do. Many people in the country were still committed to Catholicism, including many of the leaders. As well, her opponents across the English Channel and the North Sea were Roman Catholics. Very powerful and very wealthy compared to England. One Spanish ship returning from the New World with gold had more money on it than the entire annual income of the crown in England. Just the wealth disparity between her Catholic opponents and herself was enormous. So partly out of personal inclination, partly because of her internal domestic problems in England, and partly because of the international opponents she faced, she decided for a reformation of the church kind of halfway between Edward's two reformations. Not as lightly reformed as the first Book of Common Prayer, but not nearly as reformed as the second. It was a compromise position. And as you know, when you try to compromise, it made almost no one happy. The people who were least happy were those who had fled to Europe during Mary's reign. There they got a taste of what church life could be like, what leadership could be like, what worship could be like, without all the trappings of bishops who lived like princes, of a worship accompanied by smells, bells, and ceremonies. And when they returned, they were the least happy with Elizabeth's church. Well, over time, and in roughly 3 stages, there were different attempts to reform the Church of England, to further reform the church. It was a reformed church, but people wanted to make it more visibly reformed, more like all the other reformed churches from Hungary to the Caribbean. And so in the first stage of opposition to or attempts to change the Church of England, those who wanted change focused on worship. There were many things to complain about when it came to worship. First of all, the church used a lectionary. A lectionary is a set of guided readings that takes people through parts of the Bible in a planned program through the year. It was probably a good idea around 600 when the lectionary was invented. It helped increase reading of the Bible. But by this point in history, with the Bible translated in English, the lectionary really restricted reading of the Bible. Most of the Bible didn't get read. Only about 40% of the Bible would ever be read in a given year, leaving people, especially illiterate people, pretty ignorant of a lot of the Bible. And then on top of that, the lectionary guided the preaching of the church and really instructed preachers to only preach from the Gospels and not from anywhere else. So the lectionary was intended to be a set of useful crutches. But these people who wanted to reform the church, usually called Puritans, didn't think the church needed to be stuck with crutches when people were ready to run. The lectionary was a problem. There was also a high quantity of fixed prayers in the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy that guided the church. Many ministers thought the prayers useful, but there were times when it was good to pray something else. Something was going on in the community, something that would better fit the sermon being preached, and so on. But the rules were you had to use the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer and nothing else. As well, there were many ministers in the church who didn't know how to preach. In fact, to be ordained did not qualify you to preach at all. Becoming a preacher is a separate track from becoming a priest. When you were a parish priest, that meant that you were equipped to baptize, to administer the Lord's Supper, and to visit people in the church if you happened to be particularly energetic, but not to preach. If the congregation was to get a sermon, it would be something that was read from the Book of Homilies. Again, the homilies were intended at first to help people learn how to preach, but most people didn't go beyond it, and most weren't even allowed to do so. To be able to preach, one had to get a license from the bishop to preach, and most people did not. So there wasn't enough preaching in the church, something I'll return to in the next lecture. There were many other things as well. People were required to kneel at communion, and those who wanted more reform in the church argued that the whole act of kneeling to the communion assumed something going on in communion that wasn't biblical. The elements were assumed to be the actual physical body and blood of Christ. And that's why people had to kneel. So they opposed kneeling. The minister did not face the congregation when he kneeled. When he administered the Lord's Supper, and they also felt that made it look more like he was offering a sacrifice than administering a supper. People had private communions. Only bishops were allowed to admit people to communion for the first time. There were godparents at baptism, which didn't really fit Reformed theology. The sign of the cross needed to be made on the baby. The sign of the cross needed to be used elsewhere. The minister had to cross himself in the service. He had to bow to the altar. And the liturgy was filled with references to saints and what seemed like possible prayers to the dead, and so on. There was lots to reform in worship, and Elizabeth wouldn't have it. The focus on changes in worship gradually grew into a concern for a changing government. Government became an increasing focus of Puritans in the 1580s and 1590s. It seemed like a government by bishops and archdeacons and priests and so on, with an entirely separate hierarchy of officials for cathedrals, was really creating a distant bureaucracy, a method of governing the church that was punitive and not pastoral. And so, having been exposed to government in Europe, many of the people who came back or who had gone to visit Scotland began to talk about a different kind of government. A government that they believed was taught in the Bible and in the early church. Presbyterianism is what we call it now. They call it disciplinarianism back then. Those who advocated for Presbyterianism were called disciplinarians because they believed that there ought to be discipline in the local church, done by the pastor. And some of them thought it should be done by the pastor and this other group of people called elders. Elizabeth was deeply opposed to Presbyterianism, as were her archbishops. And they hunted down those who wrote Presbyterian tracts. They put them in jail. They exiled them from the country. And eventually, the movement was crushed at the end of the 16th century, the end of the 1500s. At the very end of the 1500s, there was one last attempt to reform the Church of England, and here the focus was on doctrine. A fellow named Arminius had begun teaching in the Netherlands, and a follower of Arminius began to critique actually, no, the way it goes, I'm sorry, Arminius' first big critique was on a University of Cambridge professor. Others began to try and promote Arminianism in England for the first time. And here, attempts to reform the church or to make sure that Arminianism didn't get into the church actually worked. The archbishops were Calvinistic in their understanding of God's grace and the gospel, and they did manage to keep Arminianism out for a while. In the middle of that dispute, a set of articles was written. These articles were meant to clarify the teaching of the church when it came to the gospel. They're called the Lambeth Articles. They were written by different bishops and approved by the archbishop, one of whose personal palaces was in Lambeth. These bishops and many others wanted the Lambeth Articles to be added to the 39 Articles, which was the confession of the Church of England. To that, the Queen said no, and then she died. Actually, it wasn't quite that dramatic. She said no, and sometime later, she died. From this whistle-stop tour of English Reformation history, a couple things emerge. First of all, there are three main issues: worship, government, and doctrine that the church had to deal with. Secondly, there were different approaches to how one might deal with being told no. When the Puritans approached the bishops and were told no reform, they tried approaching the Queen and were told no reform. They tried approaching Parliament and were told no. And when you're told no, but you believe otherwise, you need to do something about it. Some ministers, when they considered what would happen if they disobeyed the crown and her bishops, decided to conform, to do what they were told, at least most of the time. And certainly when the bishop sent one of his visitors around to check on what the churches were doing, which they did sort of every 1 to 3 years. Conformity was an option because the gospel's the most important thing, and many decided that if they weren't going to preach the gospel, someone else might come in who didn't believe in preaching at all, or wasn't licensed to preach at all, or was an Arminian. And so conformity was a live option for many. Another option was, of course, nonconformity. And nonconformity could take many different forms. It could be occasional, as I've suggested. You perhaps normally do not use the Book of Common Prayer, or you use parts of the Book of Common Prayer, or you use the Book of Common Prayer only when the Archbishop shows up. Or you just might risk, or not the Archbishop, the Bishop shows up, or you might risk penalties. For those who decided not to conform, even when the bishop or the bishop's agents were there, some of them could avoid the long arm of ecclesiastical law because they had rich, powerful patrons who would hire lawyers to challenge the bishops when the bishops tried to put them in jail or to fine them. Others would always end up being sick on the Sunday when the visitor was present. Just chronic ministerial occasional sickness. They'd go off to see their mother or whatever it might be. So disappearing. And someone just faced prison and hardship for not conforming. There's just one quick story. There's the people would often tell on you were the church wardens. Church wardens are it's kind of like a super trustee, someone in charge of the building. One of the jobs of a church warden is to make sure dogs don't bark in church. Church wardens were supposed to make sure that animals didn't urinate on furniture in the church. There were not pews in the church, but pulpits, baptismal fonts, and so on. Animal control is a big part of the church warden's job. But one Puritan minister knew that his church warden was tattling on him to the bishop, and he thought, I've got to get rid of this guy. It's pretty hard to get rid of a church warden. It has to absolutely catastrophic failure of duty to get rid of a church warden. And so the pastor arranged to have a farmer in the church drive a horse into the church in the middle of his sermon. Then he faked being indignant. No, who let the horse in? You know, what kind of a church warden do we have anyways? And they got rid of the church warden. Most Puritans were not that dramatic or creative. One minister did think of, in addition to conformity and nonconformity, there was one minister who came up with the idea of overconformity. When the bishop or the bishop's assistant arrived, I don't remember which, he crossed himself in the name of Jesus, but he just kept crossing himself. He did bow to the altar as he was supposed to. When he bowed to the pulpit, bowed to the baptismal font, bowed to the congregation, he did not conform, he just overconformed, and his congregation quite clearly understood what he thought of the rules. Well, these problems persisted throughout Elizabeth's reign, and then they continued to some degree in James's reign. James did like preaching. There was a difference between the two of them. And James was also a Calvinist for the first 17 or 18 years of his time in England. He had previously been a king in Scotland as well. James changed his tune in the 16 teens. You may remember, if you've got a little church history under your belt, that one of the things that happens in 1618 is there's a synod in the Netherlands, the Synod of Dort. Well, James was enough of a Calvinist to send a bishop and other ministers of the Church of England to the Synod of Dort to be representatives. James, however, also was trying to marry one of his sons to a princess. And most of the options, in fact, I think all of the options, were Catholic options. And the House of Commons, which was pretty seriously Protestant at the time, and many of the members were actually Presbyterian leaning, were appalled that the king would not choose an English woman and would prefer a foreigner who was a Roman Catholic. And the House of Commons in the late 16 teens began to be quite critical of the king. As well, in 1618, what's called the 30 Years' War began in Europe. A bloody war that, in many places, took out a third of the population. Terrible war. Roman Catholics mostly fighting Protestants mostly, with the Protestants eventually really struggling to do well. And James would not send English forces to help the Protestants, even though the Dutch queen was his own daughter. The House of Commons was very critical of that as well. So James the Calvinist becomes angry with the House of Commons, with these Puritans who are daring to criticize him for his rule. And when the Synod of Dort was finished its work and came up with the Canons of Dort, when ministers wanted to add the Canons of Dort to the 39 articles, this is the second attempt now to make the 39 articles really clearly Calvinistic, James said no. And in fact, he began to pick Arminians and make them his bishops. So the plight of the Reformed becomes worse at the end of James's reign than it even was during Elizabeth's. James was replaced by his son Charles. And the problems that simmered under James and Elizabeth and James, came to a boil under the reign of King Charles I. There were long-term problems. It's with King Charles that we begin to see an intensification of short-term problems. First of all, Charles aggressively promotes Arminians in the church. As well, the kinds of people he promotes to be bishops are those who are not actually happy with Elizabeth's Reformation. They think that she went too far in a reformed direction. And so during Charles' reign, a man named Archbishop William Laud basically attempts a second Reformation. And they try to make the church more like it was during Henry's time, rather than Elizabeth's, and certainly not during Edward's time. To use 19th century language, more sort of high church, more smells and bells, Anglo-Catholic, really. While that's happening, the House of Commons, which was already upset with James, is even more upset with Charles, as are many of the ministers in the church. Because Charles had trouble with Parliament, he ended up with other problems as well. You might remember you might know what a Parliament is for. What's a Parliament for? A Parliament's for raising taxes. The king only cares about the Parliament because he can use the Parliament to raise taxes. But what does the Parliament say when they're asked to raise taxes? They always say, yes, of course, but. And the but is a list of demands that Parliament requests in return for raising tax money. Well, when Charles came to the throne, he called his first Parliament. They said, of course, but. And they asked for changes in the church. And he said no, and he closed down Parliament, and he'd try again. And they'd say, of course, yes, but. And they'd ask for changes in the church. And eventually Charles just said, you know what? I just won't call Parliament at all. Which no monarch had tried for a very long time. This period is called the personal rule of Charles. And here, because of religious problems, he adds two other problems. Number one, he adds a kind of constitutional or political problem. It's like a president who only uses executive rule. This alarms people who care about the rights of Parliament and the rights of law. Here's Charles running the country without consulting Parliament. Now mind you, a royal decree is not as powerful as an act of Parliament, because when the king dies, the act is dead. But kings can live a long time. So we have a religious problem, now we have a political problem, and then we have an economic problem. So not only has he alienated many of the citizens of the church and politicians of the religion, he's also alienated a lot of politicians and the legal community over constitutional law. He then alienates the business community, if you will, because he still needs money, doesn't he? And so what he does, instead of calling Parliament to raise money, he finds, or his lawyers find, in medieval statutes, old laws that people have long ago forgotten about. He revives those old laws that were never canceled. And he uses them to raise money. He also stretches the law. The ports of England have something called ship money. Ship money is used in times of war for defense. And towns, or ports, I should say, along the coast of England can be taxed extra so that they can build up the fortifications of the town in a time of war. Well, Charles began in a time of peace to charge ship money, which is basically an import-export duty. He began to use ship money on towns that were not on the coast, but inland. And not in a time of war, but in a time of peace. Of course, there were legal challenges, but the judges were bought out, and by one vote, they voted in favor of the king. And so now what has he done? He's created these three short-term problems that are incredibly intense in England. The religious problem, to which he's added a political problem, to which he's added an economic problem. Now, even then, things might not have fallen apart if it weren't for the fact that Charles was the king of three kingdoms. Since the time of the Tudors, the English had claims of Henry, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. The kings of England had conquered Ireland and claimed that as a second kingdom. Really a colony, but they called it their kingdom. So the king was really king of England and Ireland. And then when James came to the throne, who was already the king of Scotland, suddenly he was the king of Scotland, England, and Ireland. And the problem comes in 1637. In 1637, Charles has the bright idea of trying to make Scottish Presbyterians worship and govern like English Anglicans. He hadn't been to Scotland for a long time, and was advised by Roman Catholics who said everyone would think this is a great idea. So the test balloon, the first service was held in sort of the flagship church of Scotland in Edinburgh in 1637. And a woman, people brought their own chairs to church. A woman was sitting on her milking stool when she saw the minister show up in a surplice, this white gown with, you know, the bands looking quite fancy, and bringing in a Book of Common Prayer that was even sort of more high church than the Church of England's version. As the minister began the service, she grabbed her milk stool and threw it at him. I never have found out if she missed or hit the preacher, but what ensued was a riot. And then the Scottish, who felt like the king had been neglecting them politically and economically, and had now blundered religiously, banded together and made a national government that said they were going to oppose the king. And then when negotiations didn't go well, the Scottish did what no one had done for a long time. They invaded England. The Scottish formed an army and marched into England. Well, the Scottish had been voluntarily fighting Roman Catholics on the continent for a while. They were battle-hardened generals who knew how to fight. And when Charles tried to address the Scottish army problem, you know, a king really can't have an army from one of his kingdoms in the other kingdom, eating other people's food, sleeping in their beds. So when he tried to address this problem, he knew what he'd have to do. He'd have to call Parliament. But he didn't want to call Parliament. So he kind of scrabbled together an English army and sent them north, and this poorly trained, poorly financed English army sort of looked at the Scottish army and said no. And so Charles tried to negotiate. That didn't go well, and eventually in 1640 Charles did the unthinkable. What was unthinkable for him? He called the English Parliament. He called Parliament because he knew he couldn't get enough money for a good army unless he did it. And what did Parliament say? Oh, of course we'll raise the taxes for the army, but, and they asked for changes in the church. He closed down Parliament almost immediately. But the Scottish kept eating English food and staying in English beds. They actually behaved themselves quite well, but nonetheless they were an army in England. And so later in 1640, the king called Parliament again, and this time Parliament said, sure, we'll give you tax money. First of all, you may not prorogue or cancel Parliament until we say so. And the king agreed to this demand, was later to discover that this was his undoing. And then Parliament made other demands. But Parliament did raise the money. But instead of giving it to the king, so he could have an army and beat back the Scots, they sent the money directly to Scotland and said, will this be enough for you to go home? And they said yes. The king was apoplectic with anger. He also realized that the Parliament no longer trusted him, and therefore he began secretly negotiating with the Irish. Now the Irish were mostly Catholic, and unfortunately in the English imagination, the Irish were also barbarians, cannibals. They were terrified of the Irish. So the fact that they were, primitive beings and Catholic made the discovery of this secret correspondence, because it was discovered, terrifying to the English. So Parliament began to raise its own army when it heard the king was trying to raise an army. And so it's because the king was the king of 3 different nations and had problems in each of them, including in the end a revolt in Ireland, that by the mid-1640s, the war began in 1642, by the mid-1640s, there was civil war in Ireland, and in Scotland, and in England, as well as armies from the Irish in Scotland and the Irish in England, and the English in Ireland by the end of the decade, and the English in Scotland, and the Scottish in England, and so on. The bloodiest war in the history of what is now the United Kingdom. Not in terms of the total number of lives lost, but the lives lost compared to the size of the population. It was by far the worst war in their history. Now, what has this to do with the Westminster Assembly? Well, when Parliament saw that one of the causes of the war was religion, they set up committees to try and talk through how they might reform the church. But they're also trying to conduct a war at the same time. And in fact, we can't do this. What we need is a body of theologians who will talk about these matters for us and then make suggestions. And so, after a bunch of failed attempts in 1643, in the summer, July 1st, 1643, an assembly gathered at Westminster, which is the city next to London. Now they're kind of glued together. Right across the street from Parliament is this huge abbey called Westminster Abbey. And the Westminster divines met there. Divines are basically theologians. These ministers, pastors, and academics met together in Westminster Abbey to try and solve 3 problems. They were told to clear the doctrine of the church from false aspersions. In other words, clarify the doctrine. A false aspersion might be something like, the doctrine of the Church of England really is Arminian. That's a false idea. The Assembly was supposed to clarify that. Then it was also to settle or reform the liturgy, which is the worship of the church, and its government. And those are the very 3 issues that Puritans had been working on for such a long time. They were finally given permission to address at the Westminster Assembly. Well, what are the lessons we can learn from this? Let me just mention 5 very briefly. First of all, there's a lesson that the Westminster divines themselves would not really see, and that's this. The providence of God is much harder to read than we sometimes think. During the 1640s, the Puritans were very confident as they looked at God's providence that their apparent success was a clear sign of the Lord's favor. The problem with that is that part of their success was these ministers aligning themselves completely with the side of Parliament. And it turns out Parliament wasn't very perfect. Parliament began to have its own abuses of what we would today call human rights. The law was often neglected by Parliament. They would imprison people without due process. In fact, they imprisoned more people than anyone had ever done before. The River Thames was filled with ships that were filled with prisoners who had not been given any trial at all. As well, Parliament removed ministers from their pulpits, not because they were ungodly or unlearned, but they removed many ministers simply because they were anti-parliamentarian and because they thought that the war was unjust or sided with the king. So the reputation of these Puritans, as confident as they were with God's favor, was somewhat tarnished by what Parliament itself did. I think it's fair to say that if we look at the worst abuses of the war, the atrocities of the war are on the side of the king and not Parliament. But God's providence is sometimes a little harder to read than we think. And then there's the flip side of this. Puritans were very concerned, even despondent, about the rise of theological error in their own day. All of a sudden, once the war broke out, the censorship process that had been used for speech and for print kind of broke down to a large degree. And the streets began to fill with anti-Trinitarians and Anabaptists and antinomians and all kinds of stuff. There weren't as many as these ministers thought there were, but they were all pretty alarmed. And when Baptists began preaching and when anti-Trinitarians began writing, they were appalled and went from the joy of the early 1640s to a sense of kind of horror that everything was out of control. But actually, the presence of all every sane minister at the time regretted these problems. But in God's providence, the fact that there were not only Roman Catholics in England, but that there were anti-Trinitarians and people who were against any kind of pastoral ministry and so on and so forth. Because there were so many more errors in the 1640s. When the Westminster Assembly began writing its confession and its catechisms, it turns out that these documents address many more different kinds of errors than they would have if it weren't for all of these problems. And so although they were confident that God was with them and then confident that God wasn't, God was using all of these events, including the rise of bad preaching and bad writing, to really shape the debates they had and the texts they wrote. And it's really made them much more useful. On any given doctrine, let's say justification, not only the errors of Roman Catholicism that's addressed, but any number of other errors are also addressed. And the texts are written very carefully to avoid a variety of problems, all because of the rise of error in the 1640s. Well, I think another possible lesson to learn here is just how difficult it is to contain protest. In 1646, the Westminster Assembly would write these words. I have them in your outline. It's the duty of people to pray for the magistrates, to honor their persons, to pay them tribute and other dues, to obey their lawful commands, and to be subject to their authority for conscience sake. Infidelity or difference in religion does not make void the magistrate's just and legal authority, nor free the people from their due obedience to them. I'm a Canadian, I'm not going to talk about the American Revolution. My point is that they wrote these words while supporting armies that were at war with the king. And they could do so because they did not think that some of the king's commands were lawful. Remember that important adjective in what I just read? But before the end of the decade, supporters of Parliament began to think that the commands of Parliament were not always lawful. By 1649, the king would lose his head in a trial that was really a travesty of justice, to the dismay of the Presbyterians who thought things were getting out of hand. They had insisted that the king be honored even when they were at war with him. They did not think that he deserved death. And in the next decade, the nation would just see a string of military coups and parliamentary failures and so on. One government set up and crashing down after another. As Westminster divines argued, there is such a thing as just war. And there are even times for legitimate protests, even rebellions. Figuring out when such a protest or rebellion should take place is not easy to do. Guessing where it will eventually lead is impossible. And here is a lesson that some divines began to really reflect on in the 1650s. Well, there's also three lessons that I can mention very briefly that they would expect us to pick up on based on their own priorities. You know why the church has church historians, right? We only exist for Reformation Day. I mean, all the rest of the teaching we do during the year, it's really just to keep us going until Reformation Day comes. And when Reformation Day comes, you know what we're supposed to do. We're all supposed to talk about the five solas. Sola Scriptura, Sola Fide, Sola Gratia, Sola Christo, Sola Deo Gloria. And these are, by the way, really great things to talk about at Reformation Day and throughout the year. But one of the great features of the Reformation, and one that we don't talk about very often, is that the Reformers didn't really believe in just five solas. They all made confessions and catechisms. They believed in thicker statements, not thinner ones. And they felt that thicker statements actually best supported these key doctrines. And those Puritans who wanted change during Elizabeth's day wanted to add to the 39 Articles. They wanted an even bigger confession. The 39 Articles actually does a decent job with the gospel. But they wanted to clarify things. They wanted a thicker confession. And so one of the things that we can learn from this kind of long history of compromise is that our forefathers wanted to see full statements of the faith. They cared about the full counsel of God, and not simply the gospel. Second, they cared about worship. Recovery of the gospel was not enough because they wanted the whole counsel of God. But recovery of the gospel was also not enough because they wanted the church to be reformed, not just in its doctrine, but in its worship. Indeed, one of the ways that we can distinguish between the Lutheran and the Reformed traditions is the Lutherans were principally about the recovery of the gospel. The Reformed were principally about the recovery of worship. By the way, these two things are not at odds with each other, because the only way we can worship God is through Jesus Christ, who is our mediator, which is why we pray in His name and proclaim His name. The two are not at odds with each other, but the one is a thicker concept than the other. Not just the gospel, but worship through the giver of the gospel. The Reformed risked much, including jail time and exile, to try and reform worship. And the third reason why the gospel wasn't enough, because they also cared about good government. The best way to support the gospel and good worship and the teaching of the full counsel of God is to have the right kind of government in the church. The importance of good government is that it supports everything else. But as these Puritans would come to argue, good government is also important in its own right, because the Bible actually does teach a form of government. Not just that the church needs leaders, but how that leadership ought to behave. And so the history, the prehistory of the assembly, just gives us these really important bullet points of things that they might not have been able to see at the time, and then these different priorities, which will end up proving important, and which we'll talk about in the coming lectures.